Reason, what it stands for, it's REASN, and it's the Racial Equity Action Support Network.
The idea of the name was to focus on both action, so really helping people to enhance the action they're taking around racial equity, but also support. So being a space where folks who are doing the work of racial equity come together, let down their guard, and be real about how hard this work can be.
And really understanding that each one of us, as we do the work, we're a little node in a network. How do we move from being a network to being a community of action, a community of practice, if you will, and from there moving to becoming a community of influence?
Mental models are the sort of unconscious ways that we understand the world. It's basically these beliefs and values and ideas that we hold in really deeply, and we don't necessarily articulate those all the time, right? We're just operating on them. We're making decisions based on them. We're approaching our work based on them. Part of what we're trying to do in Reason is to try and surface some of those mental models that are perpetuating racial disparities and really talk about them in a way that people don't usually talk about them.
I don't change anyone's heart or mind. They do it themselves. So I let go of that to begin with, that I'm going to go out and change somebody. What I do is I go out and I offer people information and a new way of seeing things. If they choose to accept it, they will change their own mental models. It's not about making someone believe what you believe. That would be nothing more than my acquiescing. What you want is for them to see that what they're looking at, that there are other views, and those views are just as valid. And in seeing all of the new data, the reason we get to that point is that we begin to close off, and so we don't see all of the other data that's out here. We only see the data that my data is the only real data, right? So I don't see all of this other stuff. So the idea is to give people space and place where they can see my data, your data, everybody else's data, and go, uh-oh, maybe my mental model isn't quite so right. Maybe I need to go back and check this. The research around what happens when your core values, your mental model gets challenged, that it is the same as being slapped in the back of the head. It's like amygdala hijacking, only about your core values. And so we do the same thing, fight, flight, freeze. The rest of our brain freezes.
Once you have that mental model in place for that belief, even if you hear data that disagrees with it, you're like, I don't think that makes sense.
My data is the only true data.
Right, right.
What ends up happening is that as we select the data and we build our beliefs determine what data we actually select.
Yeah.
And so we have a tendency then to narrow our frame, our scope.
I think there's this way that, especially when mental models they're part of the dominant culture, so they're very normalized, and they've been passed down like generation after generation, that it's hard for people to even question it. So I think that's one of the things I have found as an antidote, is not necessarily to like introduce even like something different, but just to say, is this really working for us? It doesn't feel to me like it's working for us.
Yeah.
When our mental models get so cemented, we aren't learning new things. We aren't taking in new perspectives or new ideas. And it's like even just encouraging people to be in a space of learning and exploration, I think can be powerful.
The concept is like really a bizarre concept to even entertain, because we didn't bring ourselves here, and we have responsibilities while we're here. So this concept of individualism or the individual is, I would say, certainly a more modern way for people to express themselves.
As a modern construction, I see it really in connection with the creation of the nation state and white supremacy being built into the nation state and the myth of bootstrapping. I came here with nothing and I made it on my own, and there we see this myth of being out of history, out of time, out of context, in a vacuum. You can do it on your own. It's weak if you ask for help.
Individualism perpetuates racism in that it takes away the responsibility of being connected or being responsible to someone else. This idea that I can do or be anything that I want to without any regard to the rest of the human family is problematic. and it actually helps people to, again, turn themselves from their humanity into being this thing. I am my job. I am what I make. I am where I live, as opposed to just being a human being. Mm-hmm. And understanding that being a human being is enough. So what I think is when I am able to either see others as less than being human, or I see myself as being less than human, that is the perpetuation in and of itself.
I see that individualism perpetuating racism in two different ways. I think it robs white people or people of European heritage this wonderful opportunity to see that they're part of something, mm-hmm. that they're part of thousands of years of loving and crying and art and music and all the good stuff of community. And if you see yourself as an individual, what happens to those thousands of years in the making? It just, poof, it goes away. And I think it undermines, for communities of color and indigenous communities, I think it undermines our innate knowings. Well, how do you know that? I mean, one of the things we've been joking around about today is, oh, well, did a study prove that? So now we have epigenetics, where, you know, my grandmother and my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, they knew stuff. And they said, well, because my ancestors knew this stuff, but now we have science that proves that we have cellular memory. So when we have this individualism, we lose magic, we lose history, we lose our connection. And if we're really going to tackle the disparities that are created because of white supremacy and racism, we have to come together. So I think there's a big danger in saying, well, obviously we haven't made the changes that we need because we don't have a hero. You know, we need this one person, the individual. And that's not how big changes get made, right? It's all these, the teeny people, me and you, coming together with dreams and goals and visions and so much love that makes that's how we build movements of change.
Yeah. Part of our greatest successes as human beings has been to create the tribe, the unit, the family, the community, the village, the city, and all of those things being in relationship with one another. Everything that is a part of our human existence is contained in this small sphere, and we have to figure out how to work with each other.
Well, I think there becomes a continuation of myth-making to try to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. One of the ways I see it coming up is in public health messages, individualism coming up in public health messages. Well, if you just ate the right foods and exercised, you wouldn't have diabetes, heart disease, and we can see in the early 1900s when white insurance companies were saying, well, we don't need to give insurance to new immigrants or black people because they're weaker and they're just going to die off. So we create these stories instead of looking at systemic problems. And I think individualism really gets in the way of thinking that connected, seeing a constellation. So we're too busy looking at this one star. If we're really going to regain our humanity, we really get to see the whole Milky Way. I think it's the most effective way to take things on. Otherwise, we just say, well, so sorry that happened to you.
Yeah.
You know, it kind of invisibilizes microaggressions, which are not micro at all. And we don't see, wow, oppression is systemic, and it's hundreds of years in the making.
Us and them is a mental model that I think shows up really a lot in Minnesota.
It is very specific to naming one right way of thinking. When there is only one right way, that means anybody else who might have a different way of thinking or being and living, hold a different set of values, is wrong.
It's both what happens in an individual power holder's mind or an individual person who's in the dominant or mainstream group. I'm a white person. I have been trained a lot to do us and them thinking. It manifests then in the whole systems. It's one of the places our equity gap is coming from.
So when I think about us versus them, or us and them as a mental model, I think about polar opposites on a magnet, polarized ends that would push one another away. And so I think the us versus them is very polarizing and creates a really firm distance. And I also think of a tension rod. A tension rod needs tension.
Yes.
To sustain whatever is going to be hung on it, whether it's political beliefs, religious beliefs, beliefs around gender. So I think about a tension rod.
It's like it's not doing its job unless there's real tension, and that's true, I think, for the us's in us and them. It's like, okay, part of our job is to create these institutions that will increase that tension.
I think the other words that come into my mind when thinking about us versus them, us and them, stick with your own kind, or a phrase, stick with your own kind.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that goes back to, in history, as I understand it, it takes me back to the era where segregation was firmly rooted in that idea.
Part of the words that come to my mind are actual signs in the U.S. South. You know, this is the Negro waiting room in the bus station. This is the school that so-called colored children can go to. Those are the words that were used to make a whole legal and social structure around us and them. That's how deep us and them is.
Thinking about the work that I do, very focused on creating organizational change. The us versus them mental model shows up in ways of resistance. It can be very quiet resistance, because you can show up in meetings and propose a more adaptive way of meeting people's needs on a human level, on a systemic level. And if people really don't agree with that, they may not say it in a meeting. Then what happens outside of the meeting? There's another meeting. And it's a meeting between people who are very similar in thinking, like, no, there's only one right way to provide this support, to work with people from this community.
When racism came along, and you know, the kind of racism we're talking about is only happened when Europeans, again my ancestors, started colonizing everybody else. It had all kinds of templates to just fit right into, because there was already a strong us and them. You know, I probably better not start naming the institutions or we won't be able to, you know, but religious institutions, education, philosophy, you know, social structures, us and them was well in place. And so Europeans and now white United Statesers just grooved right in.
So this mental model of us versus them perpetuates racism, because there's a high tendency to focus on the differences. It can amplify the distance between different groups, different racial groups, and make sure that there's no bridges built. So the counteraction to the mental model of us versus them is to build trust. To build that trust, a solid ground of trust that can leverage that kind of relationship to push people, challenge people to think, what if we find two commonalities across racial difference? Let's start there.
I firmly believe, and I see in my experience, that we long for each other. We long to be connected across these constructed lines of difference. And tapping into that longing is not easy. But it's not easy because the trust that Cardina spoke about is you know, it has been long ago lost. So it's not easy, but to go to that heart level of my survival, my very existence is completely intertwined with your very existence. We can't do it, but doing it together. When we get to that level, my experience is a lot of things open up.
So the mental model we're talking about is either or, which the way I understand it is how often when we're thinking or we're talking about things, we have to place everything into one or two categories. We're either this or we're that. And it's either black or it's white, and there isn't a lot of room for gray.
There's no room for thinking along a spectrum or having understanding that there are different ways.
Either or thinking is limiting because we're dealing with social constructs, and social constructs never capture everything. Right? So often when we talk about race, because we're thinking of solutions for race equity, really only talking about race on a black and white paradigm. You know, we're thinking about either folks are white and privileged or they're black and they're marginalized. For example, the Latino community. Latinos don't fully fit into one or the other because we're mixed. We bring nuances and differences that challenge the thinking about race.
One of the things about either or thinking is that it doesn't allow you to accept different truths and other perspectives. And story sharing is a great way to come to accept other people's truths. It's just the worldview has been different, our experiences have been different, and it doesn't mean that you're right and I'm wrong or I'm wrong and you're right, but we actually do just have two truths at the same time. So story sharing, I think, is a great way to effectively combat how we think in like these dichotomies.
We have to buy in to the either or thinking and the oversimplification, and we put these values in there. And so that's deeply, deeply held. When we get challenged, when people just give you the data on like, actually what you're saying isn't true, it's an oversimplification in this way, or that's hard. It's easier to just, even when you have the data in front of you, to say, no, that's not real. I'm gonna stick with my either or thinking because I don't know how to dwell in the gray. But I think when you share stories, it's a more inviting space because you're hearing someone else's experience. Like you're moving somebody's heart.
Capitalism, racism it's really made it so that way story sharing is not a part of our daily lives. The processes that we go through in our daily lives, getting jobs, things like that, story sharing is really just not a something that is ingrained in the process. And so our natural tendency, I think, just living in the environment that we live in is to have this either or way of thinking, but it's just so important to find a healthy way to combat that, just because it's so pervasive in the way that we move in this society and our culture.
Once we start to disagree, then we have a tendency that we're going to disengage because you're talking about someone's core values, and as soon as you start to challenge someone's core values, they will argue back, and if they cannot convince you that theirs is the more right data, they will disengage in the dialogue.
You can tell me all the facts in the world. This is 76% of why you should believe this, but if it doesn't fit in my frame, then I totally disregard it as perhaps even real or relevant information, and that's how I disengage, by totally distancing myself from everything you have to say. We have this big sort of cultural umbrella value about competitive listening, and we're not actually listening with our hearts. We're constantly thinking about the next thing that we're going to say because we've already engaged in that debate.
It is interesting because when we think about how trauma impacts us and how having our core values or our mental models and worldviews challenged, the research tells us that it is the same response that we get as if a toxic event happens. It in fact will hijack the amygdala in the same way, send us to that place of fight, flight, freeze, and literally we're struggling to figure out how we're going to deal with this.
You go into defense mode, you try to protect everything that you've known and how you've protected yourself this far, and how can that possibly change, because then my whole life will radically change.
And once the amygdala kicks in, the rest of your brain is kicked out.
Yeah.
To hear and to be in the dialogues that we're talking about in a way that will actually change things, we have to be in this space. And it is a heart space.
It is.
It's not a head space, it's a heart space. Rather than going in and tackling a problem, I have to create space and place where people feel safe enough that they can have the dialogue without having the amygdala take over. So the implications for me is that, and for the dialogue, is that it's the time before the dialogue that everyone would say is the meaningful dialogue takes place. But this is the space, the pre-work that has to be done to build the relationships that will facilitate all of the conflict and the challenges that will come. But it means that I've got to do this pre-work with people, which is what in most cases people don't want to do. They want you to go in, do the work, do, and they don't realize that the dialogue in itself is the do. That's where the big piece happens.
So to be able to handle that if disagreement or conflict comes up, which it always does, how do we handle this? How can we come back? How can we give people an onboarding ramp off of that disengagement? Even if it's the next time we meet, like how can we revisit these things and re-engage with each other and the topic?
That's the piece that will hold everything together later on, and not just in that session, but in sessions to come. And if they can actually stay in that space long enough, what they'll create is a community of practice. And within that community of practice, people will forget about who brought the work to the table. They'll just start to do the work. And they'll let go of all of the preconceived ideas, and new things will start to come. That's the space of innovation. And that's what we keep saying we want. But we're not brave enough to stay in the space where the chaos happens.
I think for me as a person, as an individual, it starts with recognizing, like even naming this mental model gave me something to attach to so that I can more easily recognize when it shows up in my life. To not only then step into the discomfort and step into the disagreement, but like what is my role in that? Because where I stand as also a woman too, stepping into this conflict is, confrontational, and that's absurd, and that's outside of my role or whatever. And so thinking about, okay, so when I step into this disagreement, because now I've noticed it, how can I step into this dialogue? And then like observing my behavior in it. Just on a basic level, at least for me, it takes noticing and leaning into it in a conscious way. And that's also shaped by understanding the ramifications of what happens when I disengage. And
I'm interested in figuring out how do we tackle this dialogue around racism with everybody in the room. So what is the way that we create the space that's safe enough for everyone to be there? Because if all we do is we begin to reach that space where we're engaging, then there's the conflict and the tension and we disengage and run away, we never solve this problem. In fact, in my mind, what it says is that folks want this to continue this way so that the status quo remains. I'm not interested in it staying the same. I'm interested in us changing the discourse. I'm interested in us changing the language so that everybody can feel safe enough to be in the dialogue. How do we go away from the disagreement, disengagement piece to more of an understanding that we're going to have disagreements, and that's okay. The very term diversity in and of itself means inviting in things that are different. That means conflict. And yet we seem to be conflict averse when it comes to this. We have to figure out how to be comfortable with the conflict and be able to stay in the space and have the dialogues that we really need to have so that we can move beyond this.
I mean, I think it's so connected to our economic system. So in terms of just like people being really focused on taking care of me, and I think that extends often to people's nuclear family. So like, I got to take care of my own, right? Or people say like, you're in it on your own. So there's lots of these, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Like, why don't you have someone else pull you up? Maybe
or is it even possible? I mean, if you think about it, is it possible to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps? It is physically impossible, but that's what we always keep talking about.
Because it's interesting when you said, that you're a part of this broader whole, but I think for a lot of white people, they cannot tell that they're a part of a broader whole.
I don't think they have to.
There's not.
They've never had to.
Right.
And that's a part of the privilege that goes along with it. Until you have to be in a collective and know you're in the collective,
right,
or else you can't function. If you don't have to, then that's, in certain people's mind, that's a gift. I just call it privilege.
Yeah.
I don't have to recognize it, and I won't. The dominant culture has a belief that people are individuals, and thus to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And so if you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you become them or the other, okay? Because I can certainly pull myself up by my bootstraps. So look, I am independent. I am an independent organism who can survive.
Yep.
That's the dominant culture belief. And so then when I see you as that person that can't pull yourself up by the bootstrap, I can make you then an other.
Yep.
And I can marginalize everything that goes on with you because you don't have the ability to do this, therefore you're less than. Which then falls into this place where we can classify people and make them less than human.
Yep.
And then whatever we do to them is okay.
Right.
And that is the basis of the systemic racism and the other pieces that we see, the whole institutionalization.
Like you come to have this conversation with us about collaboration. And I know you've told me you see this all over the place, where you're working with people and you're like, why are these people over here working on this? And these people over here are working on this, and nobody is talking to each other. To me, that is part of the individualism mental model. Like it's individual organizations maybe it's not like just one person, but it's where instead of seeing the value in working collectively, we want the value to just be for us or for our organization.
Right, and that's the individual again, as you said. And so how do we begin to bring them together and frame them as one as opposed to three individual siloed things?
Systemic racism is a systemic issue. It means you have to actually look at the complexity of the whole system. So I was just talking to some people about health equity and this idea of like health in all policies, right? And they're saying, well, the people of the transportation department are like, we don't do health, we do transportation. And I get that, but it's like, in some ways it's like, well, the health people need to be thinking about transportation and the transportation people need to be thinking about health. Like, and I think we've built our whole culture and our whole approach to making our world function based on like these separations and on this individual thinking of like, this is an individual problem and we're gonna have like our solution is just gonna be this piece. And so I just don't know that we can address systemic racism or any systemic issue in this current structure. I think for me, one of the antidotes has been in my own community with white people to ask like, at what cost? So you're gonna pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and what does that actually mean for your quality of life? And what does that actually mean for what your life is like when things get hard? Or, I just think developing relationships. I mean, I think again and again about the fact that we live in a really segregated world. Like most, and particularly right here in Minnesota, like a lot of white people don't know any people of color. They don't have any real relationships with people of color. And I'm like, there's just so many things about the world that you can't really understand if you're only seeing things through the lens of your community and like the lived experience of people really similar to you. So I also think there's something about just helping people think about getting out of their comfort zone and being in relationships.
Part of the way to deal with this for me is to figure out how do I get people in that space who do have divergent ideas of what the world is, and see if there's a way for us to just have the dialogue so that we can see each other as human beings, to share the stories that absolutely build the relationships, that give us a little bit more humility around this. Because the longer we stay tangled in this web, the more difficult it is to figure out how we're actually going to do this work.